Test, test. Oh, that's loud. Okay.
Not last week, but the week
Test again.
before.
That's a little better.
But I think
Okay, it'll be down here, so yeah. All right, it's about 10 after, so we'll get started here in 30 seconds. All right, well, good morning. Hope y'all are having a great week so far. Thanks for coming back this week on our series on making of a spiritual leader. Last week, we talked about our first phase of spiritual development, our sovereign foundations phase, which is kind of our grown-up years and the circumstances that we're born into, our early adolescent experiences. We talked about how God is already embedding personality traits and characteristics into our lives and kind of setting us up for future opportunities to accept Him and then in the future use those personality traits, life experiences, and characteristics to lead and mold ourselves into the leader He wants us to become. So today, we're talking about phase 2 of inner life growth, and this clicker's not working. There we go. So June 23rd, inner life growth, that's our phase 2. So we're going to spend some time in this phase today talking about some of the process items that God puts in front of us in this phase 2 period after we have gone out of this sovereign foundations period. And there's 3 particular ones that we're going to talk about and really spend a lot of time on. And then we may have some time at the end for you to kind of reflect and think about how those process items might have come up in your life as you went through phase 2 inner life growth. So remember our 4 key biblical principles that we're talking about as we think about this timeline and the spiritual development process. God's at work in the world. God's work in our past develops us for leadership. God has a future for us that He's preparing us for. We talked about providence, timely preparation for future eventualities. And 4th, God teaches insights through experiences in life, and we can use this timeline as a series of patterns to help us identify and recognize how God is teaching us those insights and moving us forward. Before we review the timeline, last week in Sovereign Foundations, there were 5 process items that we talked about within that first phase. Does anybody remember what one of those process items were? Chris?
I didn't remember, but I took notes.
There you go. Okay. Give me one.
So the first one was destiny preparation.
Yep.
You said it's things that are a hint at some future or special significance.
Yeah, exactly. So destiny preparation, something that hints at future significance or kind of foreshadowing into a spiritual opportunity. So a couple of the examples that we talked about were John the Baptist coming to prepare the way for Jesus. I talked about a former minister, Steve Clore, whose dad gave him a pulpit when he was young as kind of a destiny preparation item for him to come into that role later on in life. What else? There's 4 others. Yes? Yep, mentor, divine contact, someone that comes into your life at a young age and kind of molds and shapes the principles that you begin to create for yourself and then hold on to through the rest of your life. Anyone else? Michael?
Giftedness discovery.
Yeah, giftedness discovery. So opportunities that we have to explore the gifts that God has given us and really uncover those in this period of adolescence and play around with. It's a sandbox. And so we tend in this first phase to kind of take on anything and everything if we're obeying and we are obedient to God's call to find out those gifts that we're good at and those that we're not so good at. Okay, any others? Spiritual authority insights, very good. So this is kind of a confirmation from God in the direction that we find ourselves going. So we feel like either through someone else or through reading our Bible or through a strong sense of call that God is really confirming to us we're in the right place, we're doing the right things. And then the last one at the bottom is ministry affirmations. And this is very similar to spiritual authority insights, but typically would just be a note of encouragement or confirmation from a teacher or someone else just affirming you in what you're doing. Hey, you're doing a great job leading the youth group. Keep going. Keep putting yourself out there. You did a great job leading a prayer at church this morning, or you did a great job at school, teaching a peer or mentoring someone. It's just really informal. But it's an early indicator that you might be on the right track to something. Okay, very good. So those were the 5 process items we talked about in our Sovereign Foundations phase, and now we're going to move into this phase 2 of inner life growth today and spend a little bit of time talking about this. And remember, we have these 3 kind of key components of this leadership timeline or of this spiritual development process. We have patterns, which is typically what we will follow with the timeline. We have processes that are kind of sub-level items along this timeline that advance us throughout the pattern. And then we have principles, which are things that are convictions, inner beliefs, foundational truths that we develop as we grow, and we kind of hold on to those throughout the patterns and processes, yet they end up shaping our principles in the future. Okay? So, inner life growth. Clinton, in his book, says our greatest challenge as leaders is to develop godly character. And then provides a couple of quotes here that I thought were really good on what character actually is. And so Warren Wiersbe said, apart from character, ministry is only religious activity, or worse, religious business. Ooh, that's a tough one. Character is what we are in the dark. D.L. Moody. I think that's very similar to something I heard in high school. One of my coaches would always say, integrity is what you're doing when nobody's watching. And I think character and integrity are very close synonyms, and I think a good definition for character is what we are in the dark, what we regress to when nobody's watching, when there are no consequences to our actions or behavior. And so our ability to scale across this timeline and to develop and grow as spiritual leaders is directly tied to the character formation that happens in our lives over a period of time. So Clinton says that there's many lessons in the development of a spiritual leader, but none are as important as the early ones, which focus on character building. So we're going to talk about some of these process items that really build character in this inner life growth phase, which again on the timeline is usually after we have, had our conversion moment and accepted Christ, and it might be a time where you're in college or you're just married or you're a young person. Typically in this, linear framework in a nonlinear world, that's kind of where you'll find yourself in this phase. And it could be, on through into your early 30s, and then typically you will kind of hone in on your gifts and move on to the next phase. Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit more. So phase 2, inner life growth, we just talked about the timeline that this typically has. Generally, Clinton says we will start to desire to know God in a personal, intimate way. So this is after our faith has become our own. If you inherited your faith from your family, or you came to your faith just through independent circumstances, this is really a time of spiritual growth, character building, where God is still working in you and preparing to work through you as you advance. And development will typically take place through training, mentoring, and apprenticeships. That sounds all very formal, but it could be as simple as you are, really listening to the preacher on Sundays and digging in for the first time instead of zoning out or falling asleep like when you were a teenager and you didn't get enough sleep the night before. It could be that you are starting to be mentored by someone, whether it's a spiritual leader at church or whether it's someone else outside of church that is pouring into you. I talked about I had a mentor in this phase that was really passionate about building up the principles of Christ in me, and specifically the Holy Spirit and Jesus as a Savior, and building this personal relationship with Him. So that was really important time for me. And then apprenticeships. Sometimes that could be like an internship if you were serving in youth ministry, or it could be something very informal that you just kind of shadowing someone and you find yourself informally drawn to someone. And we're going to talk about giftedness development in a future lesson, but one of the things that Clinton talks about in his book on giftedness development is if you don't really know what your gift mix is, oftentimes we find ourselves drawn to people that have a similar gift mix as us. So if you feel drawn to someone, if you've heard them speak or you've interacted with them and you think, I'm really kind of drawn to that person, then you may have a similar gift mix that they do. So we'll talk about that more, but I think that's a really good kind of barometer for understanding what your gift mix might be if you feel like you don't know. In this time, we're often tested by God. He's asking us, how obedient are you going to be to me? How committed are you going to be? What are you doing in the dark, even though you say that you've accepted me and you've had your conversion moment? How are you behaving at all times, even when nobody's watching? So a couple of examples, right, of being tested by God. Joseph being sold into slavery. We talked about that on his timeline last week. Just a real testing period for him to trust in God amidst this really uncertain circumstance. And, him feeling like he was betrayed by his brothers. He's now alone in a new place. He's serving Potiphar's household and has to really rely on God. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later and how he responded to that. But a very challenging time where Joseph was tested. I thought about Moses and the burning bush, where he's coming up with all these excuses and God is continuing to push him forward to lead Israel. And, he has this moment that most of us will never get, of just this spectacle to behold, and is encountering God in the first person, takes off his shoes, and God is kind of testing him to see, how committed are you going to be to me as we go through this and as I prepare you to lead Israel. And then obviously Jesus tested in the wilderness by Satan right before he begins his ministry. I think this is a time of confirmation to God that Jesus will take on the role God has called him to do, and obviously passed that with flying colors and then started his ministry. So to wrap this up, a transition moment typically out of this phase is you might have your first full-time job, you might start to become an adult, you might have a strong sense of call to do a specific thing, whether that's vocationally or whether that's spiritually. One example might be we had a lot of friends at ACU having went there, folks that come straight out of school and go into ministry, or they go into become a missionary. That's a very strong sense of call that could boost them out of this inner life growth phase and into phase 3, ministry maturing. So let's talk a little bit about the process items within this phase that move to advance us to the next phase. So number 1 is called an integrity check. And Clinton says integrity is foundational for effective leadership. It must be instilled early in a leader's character. And we can define this integrity check as a test that God uses to evaluate our intentions to shape our character. And there are 3 parts to this integrity check. There's the challenge, there's the response, and there's the resulting expansion of ministry or whatever it is if you respond well. So Daniel chapter 1, this is right when Judah is taken over and Nebuchadnezzar calls in and wants to have some Israelite servants to help in his kingdom and provide wisdom. And so he takes some folks from Judah, Daniel, who gets renamed to Belteshazzar, I can't even say it, and then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, basically. And they are some of the folks that he is putting through this testing period for 3 years to see who will basically be in his cabinet. And Daniel doesn't want to defile himself or go against the law by eating the royal food and wine that's going to be provided over this period of 3 years. So he tells the king's servant, well, why don't you just test us for 10 days, feed us only vegetables and water, and then see how strong we are at the end, because they're afraid that they're not going to be strong enough if they just have vegetables and water. And he says, the king's going to kill me if I do this and you're not fit. And so Daniel says, well, test me for 10 days. And so this is an example of an integrity check where Daniel is able to keep his convictions. He's able to keep those principles and hold on to them. He's put to the test by God of how obedient are you going to be to the law that you're supposed to follow. And what ends up happening, right? Daniel and his friends end up being some of the strongest looking men after that 10-day period. And so they continue to only eat vegetables and water as they go through this 3-year period. And at the end, they are like 10 times as wise and as built as all of the other people that were put to the same test. And so that is how Daniel ends up serving the king, just by this one thing. So you can see the challenge, the response, and then the resulting expansion there at the end after that 3 years is over. Some of these principles that we talk about testing, it could be some core values that you're holding on to that are being tested. It could be temptation into sin. It could be going through conflict and how we respond to conflict. Some people really embrace conflict. Some people run from conflict. Some people turn into a different person when they experience conflict. And so conflict can be a way that we are tested or our integrity is tested. It could be physical or mental persecution that's happening. And I think that still can happen today. Or it could just be a loyalty test of how loyal are you going to be to me amidst the circumstances that you find yourself in, right? I think that one maybe applies to Joseph pretty well as he was sold into slavery. Okay, so what's the purpose of these? These integrity checks build that character that we talked about, and they kind of build on each other sequentially in a stair-step pattern. As you go through and you pass more integrity checks, your character continues to be built up in a very linear or exponential way. They prepare us for the future, and they teach us submission. And last point here, God will not use a leader who lacks integrity. And the passage here in 1 Samuel is talking about King Saul. When the people have asked for a king, and Samuel prays to God, God gives them Saul. Saul is anointed, he becomes king, and he's given some very specific instructions to go and destroy this town and destroy everything in the town. All the cattle, all the livestock, everything there by God to vindicate Israel, and he ends up keeping some of it. And God finds out and speaks to him through Samuel and says, because you have not obeyed, then basically, Saul, you're not the chosen king by God anymore. So as we develop in our own spiritual development, integrity is crucial to continuing down the path of spiritual development and can really cause stagnation if we fail these integrity checks. Typically, if we do, we'll continue to be tested until we can pass them. Okay, let's talk about number 2, the obedience check. And this is very similar. Oftentimes these overlap, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but an obedience check is a little bit different. And Clinton says obedience is first learned and then taught. And in this phase, this is typically when we are being taught ourselves so that we can then teach others and lead by example. So obedience check, a test where a leader learns to recognize, understand, and obey God's voice. So Genesis chapter 22, we've already talked about this example in class, but this is Abraham going up on the mountain to sacrifice his son Isaac after being commanded by the angel to do this, and then subsequently stopped when he is about to plunge the knife into Isaac's chest. And this was an obedience check by God to see how faithful Abraham was going to be to God and how much he was going to follow him no matter his level of understanding. Acts chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. This is Paul getting ready to leave the church in Ephesus to travel to Jerusalem on his 4th missionary journey. And he says, I have basically preached the best that I possibly can. I have poured myself into this church, but God is calling me to go to Jerusalem, and I need to leave and go there now. And so he's writing to the elders to let them know that he has a strong sense of call to go to Jerusalem, and that he's leaving the church in Ephesus to do so. And then we talked about Esther, right? Being obedient to God, even though she was scared that she might go to the king and he might not hold out his scepter and she might be killed right then and there. But God had led her to that purpose for this exact time to save her people and save her family. A lot of times in an obedience check, it could be that we are learning about giving, whether it's our time, whether it's our money, whether it's our resources. We're learning how to put God first and being willing to be used by God in whatever way that he's calling us to be used by him. And very practically, this could be, trusting a biblical truth, something that we've come across, read, one of our principles. This could be you're confessing sin, you're building character by shining light on that darkness that we talked about and, really bringing to light something that has been troubling you. It could be righting a wrong. If you've got, old skeletons in the closet and you're ready to get rid of those things and ready to reconcile with someone or something, this is another example of an obedience check. Clinton says one cannot have great influence unless they know how to obey God. And I think the toughest one is this last one, that obedience doesn't always hinge on understanding. That's a tough one to swallow because me, at least, I really like to kind of know what's on the other side of something before I jump into it. And oftentimes, if it's not logical, it's hard for me to accept that, to say, okay, I don't really see how that's going to be beneficial to my life because that doesn't make sense. And we always try to reason through things and rationalize through things, but obedience doesn't always hinge on understanding. And you think about Abraham and Isaac, there's no way that Abraham could have understood why he was supposed to sacrifice the only son that he prayed for to God and was finally given at this very old age. Yet that's what he did. He went up on the altar. And I said this quote a couple weeks ago, but Clinton says in his book, many are called to lay something on the altar, and they do, but they take along a rubber knife. And I thought that was just a very convicting statement about how willing and obedient we are to things that we just don't want to do sometimes. It might look like we're about to do something, but we don't really have the piercing blade ready to go. We're only halfway doing something. Okay, and number 3, a word check. So Clinton says about word check, leadership gifts primarily involve word gifts, which evolve through word checks. And we'll talk about word gifts when we talk about gifts of the Spirit, but he kind of defines word gifts as our ability to influence, whether it's a teaching gift, whether it's exhortation, whether it's encouragement. There are some other informal gifts, around benevolence and hosting that we'll talk about, but word gifts typically are a part of a spiritual leader's journey. So whether that's a word gift, meaning you're really good at teaching in front of a large group of people, or you're really, really good at one-on-one conversation, part of being an effective spiritual leader is having the ability to influence, whether it's one-to-one or one-to-many. And so this is how our ability to influence is built up in this second phase of inner life growth. These word checks really test our ability to understand or receive a word from God and then allow God to work it in our lives or to share it with others. So not only should we be absorbing information in this phase and building those principles and those building blocks of our faith, but through these word checks, we should be able to then turn that back and articulate it to someone else as to maybe why it has so much influence on us or why those principles are things that we hold so dear. A couple of examples here. 1 Samuel chapter 3, whenever Samuel is a boy and he's sleeping with Eli, he gets the Samuel, Samuel, the whisper, right, 4 times. And each time he goes to Eli and says, you called me. And Eli says, no, I didn't call you. And the next time this happens, go back and say, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. And this is a word check by God to see if Samuel can recognize his own voice and then use it, right? I thought about Jonah and his call to go to Nineveh. He kind of failed that word check, but you see how that ended up working out. He still ended up in that place, but I think that was absolutely a word check for Jonah to go to Nineveh and preach to those people. Acts chapter 20, verses 22 to 24. This is Paul again talking about when he is going to Jerusalem, feeling that he was called by God. I must have misquoted Acts chapter 5. I'm going to have to look that up after class. Acts chapter 20 is the story of Paul when he feels compelled by the word of God to go to Jerusalem. So, sorry, I missed that reference in Acts chapter 5. He says, now, compelled by the Spirit, I'm going to Jerusalem, not knowing what will happen to me there. I only know that in every city the Holy Spirit warns me that prison and hardships are facing me. However, I consider my life worth nothing. My only aim is to finish the race and complete the task the Lord has given me, the task of testifying to the good news of God's grace. So I think this is a great example of a word check where Paul has that strong sense of call that he needs to now go to Jerusalem, not knowing what he's going to face, fearful or prepared that he will probably face prison and persecution, but yet he's going anyway, right? So Clinton says, God speaks to leaders and his message is confirmed through truth. As one listens and follows, their influence is expanded. And God uses his word to convict, to motivate, to clarify, and to guide. So word checks could really impact any one of those things and reveal themselves in different ways. But again, they are really primarily responsible for developing some of those spiritual gifts that are so critical to sharing our faith and sharing the impact of what Christ has done for us, okay? All right, so Clinton says these 3 process items often overlap and can happen continually through one's life. I would argue they're probably not contained to this one particular phase. They are characteristics of things that happen in this phase, but these things probably happen all the time. I can think of integrity checks that happen continually even after I have left this phase. But they are the building blocks of inner life growth, which is the core of spiritual leadership. And Clinton says a godly leader is a person with God-given capacity and God-given responsibility to influence specific groups of people toward his purpose for that particular group. Character is foundational if we are to influence for God's purpose. And remember, we talked about God not being willing to use a leader who lacks integrity. And so as our character is built up, so is our ability to influence people for God's purpose. Okay, let's talk about these practically. Examples from Joseph's life. Number one, an integrity check that Joseph faced, not only being sold into slavery, but also being confronted by Potiphar's wife, who wanted to seduce him, right? Who was jealous and tried to get him to veer from those principles that he held dear. And he passed that integrity check by rejecting her, even at the detriment of himself going to prison. That was an integrity check for Joseph. Right before that, he kind of had an obedience check in being sold into slavery and serving Potiphar's house. And we read about in the story of Joseph in Genesis that he did that so well that the Lord blessed him and basically made him, the Lord was with him, the Lord made him very successful, the Lord really blessed him in that time, even though he was serving Potiphar's house as a slave. And then finally a word check, right? Receiving and interpreting the first dreams he had and telling his brothers the truth, even though it angered them, right? That must have been something, I don't know if it was natural for Joseph to share those dreams with his brothers, but obviously their reaction was not positive. It was very negative. And I can imagine being maybe a little bit scared to tell all of your older brothers, hey, I had a dream that y'all were all bowing down to me. And I mean, I would probably think my brothers were going to beat me up if I told them that. And they pretty much did, right? So that was early foreshadowing, early preparation for Joseph to be comfortable receiving and interpreting and sharing the meaning of dreams, even if they were negative, as they became when he started serving Pharaoh and had to tell some very difficult dreams. Okay, let's get a little bit more real and talk about a few examples from my life. I had an integrity check when I was about 18 or 19. I just graduated high school. I was getting ready to go to ACU, and then through ACU, I was kind of in an unhealthy relationship with someone who didn't share the same principles and faith values as I did. And I had some convictions and principles that were tested in more ways than one by this person or this relationship that I was in, that I had to decide at an inflection point, how important are those principles to me and how much am I going to cling to those? And so the response was to honor those convictions and break that relationship off after about a year. And the resulting expansion was, this happened like in May of my freshman year at ACU, right before we got out. And that next summer, I all of a sudden just got all these opportunities to teach and influence young people in high school. So I went to church camp with my church. I led the entire group of 9th and 10th graders there. There was about 30 of them. I led their cabin. I think I was the youngest counselor, and these people were probably, only 4 or 5 years younger than I was. And so we developed really good relationships. I had a chance to share devos with them, share about my experience of what they might expect over the next few years. I was asked to teach the youth group Bible class on Wednesday nights, which was about 5 people, but it was still the class, so I felt like that was a really good ministry task for me. My dad had met someone from the Philippines who was promoting a paper bead jewelry ministry for these women in the Philippines who would hand make these bracelets and necklaces and purses out of paper beads. And we developed a system with them where we would pay them for their product, and then we would take it to trade shows and sell it. And we would use half of our profits to send back to them and half to fund a mission trip over there. And so it became this very sustainable process that I became involved with and began helping him with. And I just felt like as soon as that relationship ended for those convictions, that all of a sudden these doors were opened for me to begin serving in many, many different ways. An obedience check. The very next summer, I had signed on to become a counselor at Pine Cove for the first time, and it was working at a family camp where all the family came and they stayed together, and we were each assigned a family, and we were to minister to them throughout the week and really be their resource, do a lot of fun things with them. But the first few weeks, before we had any campers, we were doing like manual labor and like digging in the dirt. I remember I had to wash off this cabin, like scrub it with a sponge. I was using a hatchet to cut down a bunch of overgrown trees. And I just remember thinking, like, this is not what I signed up for. I mean, compared to the hours you're working, you're really getting paid like peanuts, and it's probably not fully legal, but I'm not going to go into that. But I just remember thinking, like, I signed up to be a counselor, to play with kids, and I didn't sign up to do all this manual labor. And it wasn't until after, honestly, that I got back, I think I kind of failed this obedience check early on, but it wasn't until after I got back that I realized, what we were doing was trying to create this safe, perfect environment for these kids and these families to really spend their time deepening their relationships together and spending time focused on Christ together and making that environment so perfect for them that they didn't have to worry about anything or notice anything was out of place, but it was all taken care of for them. And that just became something that really convicted me of having more of a servant's heart. And it wasn't about the experience that I had and the fun that I got to have as a counselor, but the amount of money that I made. It was really about the people who came to grow in their own family relationship and their relationship with Christ. The Philippine mission trip that I went on, I think, wasn't necessarily an obedience check to go there, but it was an obedience check when I got back. Seeing the poverty that was stricken there, and many of you probably had a similar experience going to another country for the first time, and just seeing how simple their life was. And I remember one of the church members talking about, we don't have much, but if we only had a grape for dinner and you were hungry, I would give you half. And saw that play out so many times when we would go and visit members of this church, and they would prepare these extravagant meals for us that were probably their entire week's worth of groceries. And they only did that to serve us because they were excited to welcome us into their home. And I feel like that was an obedience check for me to kind of re-examine the way that I viewed circumstance, the way that I viewed the blessings and the opportunities that we have here to kind of reshape how I live my life. And so I think that was a really good obedience check for me in this phase. And then lastly, a word check. This wasn't necessarily the word of God specifically, although a few passages came to mind as I was thinking about this. But I read this book called Not a Fan that same summer after I got back from the Philippines by Kyle Idleman, and it really challenged and convicted me. The whole premise of the book is, are you a follower or are you a fan? And you might know everything there is to know about Jesus, but do you really know him personally? And he likens it to, you might know all the stats and all the moments about Michael Jordan, but you never met him. You don't really know him. You're a fan, but you're not a follower. And so that was really impactful on me, and I actually ended up using that to teach Bible class on Wednesdays and go through this book with these young kids. But I think that was a really good word check for me to kind of double down on my faith and dig in and really make my faith my own through the life experience that I had and through digging into the Word a little bit more and trying to know Jesus in a very personal, intimate way. One scripture reference here, 1 Corinthians 9. This was our club verse at ACU in the club that I was in. It says, "Those who compete in the games go through strict training. They do so for a crown that will not last, but we do so for a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I will not run like a man running aimlessly, nor will I fight like a man beating the air. I will beat my body and make it my slave so that after I have preached to others, I won't be disqualified from the prize." And that really spoke to me at the time of just digging in and developing spiritual discipline as I grew in my own faith to put some of these things into practice and to remember them and not just to fall back into the same patterns that I had in the past. Okay, so going back to the leadership timeline, as you think about some of these process items in your own life and hopefully start to add to your phase 2 inner life growth, this is what Joseph's timeline now looks like. Last week we talked about him being given the ornate robe, having the 2 dreams as an adolescent. This week we talked about being tempted by Potiphar's wife, having his dreams, and serving Potiphar's house specifically as preparation events to move him into phase 3 of ministry maturing. And then my timeline. Last week we talked about the mentor that I had, a young life leader who really poured into me at a young age. We talked about my church experience as a period of giftedness discovery. We talked about some ministry affirmation that I had from some peers and teachers and the things that I was doing and the ways that I was serving at school and at church. And then this week we talked about my 3 process items just now. So I've added those to my timeline up above phase 2. So hopefully you will think about these this week as things in your life and think about some of the key process items for you in your first 2 phases. So, go back to Sovereign Foundations if you haven't filled that in, and do so with those 5 process items we talked about, or a couple of them. Today, think about the integrity check, the test, the response, the expansion of ministry that happens after you passed it, the obedience check, right? This could be learning about possessions and giving, learning to trust God and finding a mate or a spiritual partner, willing to be used by God in ministry, our willingness to trust the truth that God has shown us, our willingness to forgive, confess, or right or wrong. And then one of the challenges, if you have time and you have a connection or someone that comes to mind, you don't have to interview someone, but talk to them. Talk to a mature spiritual leader in your life. Give them a 30-second overview of what these process items are, this integrity check, this obedience check, this word check, and ask them to share one and see what comes to mind for them. I think that you'll find each spiritual leader, especially those in formal leadership, will have an example to share from one of these 3 things. So that's my challenge to you if you get time, but hopefully you will use these items to fill in your phase 2. And remember, the last 2 weeks, some of you are going to be sharing your own. So take advantage and fill it in, and we would love to hear from you on the last 2 weeks. Okay, that's it for today. Thanks for coming to class, and next week we'll go over phase 3. We're going to do that in 2 parts, so it'll be part 1 of 2 on ministry maturing. Thanks.